and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favourite topics in the whole world, and I know one that is close to many of your hearts as well, which are myth retellings. But specifically what I wanted to hone in on in this video were myth retellings that were inspired by mythologies other than Greek or Roman. So I obviously spend a lot of time chatting about classical myth retellings. It's where a lot of my expertise lie in terms of like the ancient past. So I've read a lot of them, I've commented on a lot of them, and I really enjoyed a lot of them. I also love reading and learning about mythologies from all around the world, including those closer to home, and reading books inspired by those mythologies. However, probably because of how well known it is, as well as how well documented it is, when you search for like myth retellings online, 9 out of 10 times you get a Greek or Roman myth retelling. So I want to use this video to feature 10 books that I love which are inspired by mythologies other than Greek or Roman, and recommend them to you, as well as hopefully get some more recs from you in the comments. So retelling I'm using in a very loose sense here. These are all books inspired by mythologies. Some are direct, like key some are key plot point, like retellings from start to end, which follow the events of a specific myth. Some massively twist a myth, or could be considered like sequels to a myth and take place after the main event of a myth that exists. And others just like draw on elements, you know, they maybe take a creature from myth, or they take a element from a myth or a few elements and tie them into their story that's perhaps set in an ancient past, or even set in the present or the future. There's a whole list of ways in which fiction can engage with mythology, and these books do a fair few of them, so they're not all necessarily straightforward retellings, but because retelling can also have a very like broad definition and it's an easy way to categorize this kind of subgenre, it's what I'm calling them. So yeah, without further ado, let's crack on and look at the 10 books, shall we? So these books are in no particular order, but the first one I want to talk about is The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea by Axio. Now this is a very, very loose reimagining, or a story very loosely inspired by the folktale of Shimchong from Korean legend. So this is a story about a girl who basically sacrifices herself by jumping into the sea to heal her father. In this novel, however, Shimchong, although a character, is not the protagonist. The protagonist is a young girl called Mina, who lives in this village that regularly sacrifices young women, or gives up young women to be the sea god's bride, and they're never heard from again because the sea god lives deep beneath the sea, where, you know, humans cannot survive in the spirit realm. And essentially it's that time of year again, and the village have decided to sacrifice Shimchong, but Mina wants to go in her stead because her brother and Shimchong are in love, and she loves her brother and she wants to protect their relationship and protect them, and so she follows them and ends up becoming the sacrifice, or the sea god's bride, instead. And it's not what was planned. Basically it's gone against everything everyone had planned for. You know, Shimchong was like the perfect young woman, she was everything they thought the sea god might want, and they want to please the sea god in order to protect themselves and their home. However, it's Mina that goes instead, and of course chaos ensues, and Mina has to find a way to both protect her home, to get to know and learn about the sea god and his world under the sea, and possibly find a way to return, if that's even possible. And it weaves together lots of little like elements of Korean folklore with entirely fictional, incredibly intricate, wonderful fantasy world building that the author has come up with herself to create this really rich new story about love and relationships, and like finding yourself, and both like romantic and familial love, and like how much you care for people and kind of standing up for yourself. And it's such a gorgeous novel. It's a YA, like romantic adventure fantasy, I'd call it, with like Korean folklore elements and references to that folktale that I mentioned earlier. And I just adored the like intricacy of the world that Axio created in this, because obviously it is rooted in aspects of Korean folklore, but it's also her own world that she's created. And she's just employed her imagination beautifully to create a very, very vivid and immersive world with all these references that is really, really interesting, and that you kind of feel like you get to delve deep beneath, like going under the sea, and that you're fully immersed in, and I really love that about it. And then I also love the characters, and I never quite knew where it was going to go. It kind of felt like there was some obvious directions it might take, but then there was some little twists and turns and surprise reveals that I didn't see coming, which was really nice and kept me very engaged in the story. And yeah, it was overall just like a fantastic read. Next up is Sister Song by Lucy Holland, which is inspired by the British folk ballad The Twa Sisters. And this book actually follows three sisters, or three siblings, two young women and their trans brother, who is like coming to terms and figuring out his trans identity throughout the plot of the novel. The story itself is set in Dumnonia, which is a ancient Brythonic Celtic kingdom, and the three siblings are actually royalty. So, you know, they have all of the expectations upon them as royal children, that, you know, they'll like marry to create alliances, and that they'll uphold their family, and they're expected to behave a certain way. But they're all trying to figure out their own individuality and who they are as people, and that comes in different forms for each of them. They all have different journeys and different paths to go on throughout this novel, all of which are like beautifully like full and well-rounded. Like, it doesn't feel as though any of the siblings is neglected for another. They all have a very like unique, very fully formed, fully fleshed out story that interconnects with their siblings. They are not like sort of tangential in any way. And generally speaking, this story more closely follows the actual events of the Twa Sisters ballad or folk tale. It's more of like a direct retelling, but much more fully fleshed out, and with that exploration of trans identity through the third sibling, which is not part of the original ballad. I mean, I would love to say that there was tons and tons of LGBTQ+, including trans rep in ancient and medieval and early modern myth, but you know, there's not. But that was something that the author took an opportunity to explore through the fact that there are vague references to a possible third sibling in the originals, but who isn't a main character in the same way that the other two are. And in some ways this is a very tragic story. It's going to be heart-wrenching if you read it. It's quite forlorn, it's very beautifully written, but it's also so immersive and so emotive and so deep and rich, and I loved it. Now, my next two books actually are loosely inspired by the same myth, specifically the Chinese myth of Chang'e and Hou Yi, which is a story in which a married couple, so Chang'e and Hou Yi, are married. Jean, what are you talking about? So we have this married couple, and one is a legendary archer who basically has to shoot these sunbirds out of the sky in order to stop like the people on Earth, you know, like burning up. And he shoots them out of the sky until finally there's one left, and he's rewarded with a potion that will make him immortal. He and his wife choose not to drink this potion because he wants to remain like with his wife, but for differing reasons depending on the version of the myth you read. It could be like altruistic reasons, or it could be more selfish reasons. Chang'e drinks the immortality potion and ends up becoming the goddess of the moon. So the first book I actually want to talk about is Burning Roses by S.L. Huang, and this one focuses on Hou Yi's story and their side of the story. And I say they because in this reincarnation or retelling of the myth, Hou Yi is a woman. So we have Hou Yi the archeress or female archer, and we also have a secondary protagonist who, interestingly enough, is inspired by Little Red Riding Hood, so a European fairy tale character, you know, often an adventure with a Chinese mythology character, and it really seamlessly blends those two sort of folklores together, and I think in doing so explores some of the nature of folklore and mythology and some interesting aspects of that by bringing them together, which I really, really enjoy. And these two protagonists team up in order to basically go on the adventure of Hou Yi and shoot down the suns in the sky. But naturally this isn't a direct retelling. We've already got quite a few changes there, and the timelines are also quite mixed up compared to the original stories. But it's, like I mentioned, this really beautiful seamless blending of mythologies and folk folklore and storytelling and a meditation on that, whilst also having beautiful queer representation, sapphic representation, and being very beautifully written. It's like so immersive. I feel like that's a word I've used a few times already in this video, but you know, I have a limited vocabulary like everybody, and that's exactly what this book is. It really pulls you in and takes you away on a old and new folklore adventure. It's a beautiful combination of both things, and I really, really loved it. It's part of the Tor novella series, which is a series I love, rave about all the time, and I always find fantastic recommendations from and new authors to read from. So yeah, love that book. We then have, for my second recommendation related to Ho Yi and Chang'e, The Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Su Lin Tan. So this one is like a full-length novel, and it's actually the first in a series of fantasy novels, which I really feel like sort of are on that cusp of like YA and adult. I'm not entirely sure what the official designation is, but for me, I think it could really appeal to both YA and adult readers, having read it myself, and it's a really beautiful novel which actually follows the daughter of Hu Yi and Chang'e, although in this story she's never met her father, and she is a creation of the author's imagination. But in Su Lin Tan's version, the motivation for Chang'e drinking the potion was to save her daughter. So she ends up becoming the moon goddess, relegated to a palace on the moon where she's almost entirely alone, having lost the love of her life, but all in order to protect her daughter, who's then raised in this very peculiar kind of liminal place between ethereal gods and goddesses and the mortal world. But she's also a part of this like spirit realm. She has, you know, the strength of this place. She's not a normal mortal. And at the very beginning of our novel, the protagonist, the daughter of Chang'e, Xin Yan, is separated from her mother, and a large part of the story is her trying to get back to her mother. Now, it's not quite as easy as just like, you know, walking along the road. She has to go on a story of self-discovery, a mission of strength finding, a kind of political royal mission in order to find her place in society so she can reclaim that place for her mother too. And there's like a lot involved, and through that many years pass, and she also meets some possible love interests, and there's a romantic angle to her story. But I really loved the growth of her character and her sort of relationship with her mother being the motivating factor, but also how she finds herself and learns more about herself as an independent person after their separation. It's a really gorgeous book, and I haven't read the sequel yet, but I really need to, and I'm really excited to. So yeah, that's the next one on my list. So while we're doubling up, I actually have two more books which are both inspired by the same myth or legend, and then after that all of the other books on this list are unique in the myths that they're inspired by. So the next two books on my list are both inspired by 1001 Nights, which is a story within a story within a story within a story. It's a collection of stories framed by a story. If you're not familiar with 1001 Nights, it is effectively the story of Shahrazad, a young woman who is married to a king, and this king is killing all of his wives. So he's regularly remarrying, then killing his wives the day after because of basically a wife that cheated on him back in the day. So, you know, some toxicity going around there. But Shahrazad finds a way to stay alive by continuously narrating stories to the king and keeping him captivated in a way that these stories, you know, continue. So like every night he doesn't quite get to the end and he needs to wait to the next day, and she keeps him engaged and until he falls in love with her, and the kind of horrible reign that he has ruled down on his people for all this time is broken, and there's a fresh new start at the end of the story. So 1001 Nights is Shahrazad telling these stories, and therefore you get all of these stories mixed in with it, which are legends and folk tales all in their own like individual sense. You will encounter characters like Aladdin that you might have heard before in these stories, and it's one of my favourites, I think, from myths around the world and folklore around the world, because I love that Shahrazad's strength is basically telling stories. Maybe that is such a obvious thing for a reader and writer to say, but I just love that aspect of the story, so it's no wonder there's two books inspired by that on this list. The first one is also a YA romance fantasy novel called The Wrath and the Dawn by Renee Day. So this is the first book in a duology which follows our protagonist Shahrazad, who very intentionally goes to marry the king, not just to tell him stories and make him fall in love with her, but with a plan to kill him. So her friend was one of his previous wives that died, and she has set about getting vengeance for her friend, and for that reason she decides to, you know, infiltrate the palace by becoming his next wife, and she starts telling him these stories and engaging with him and getting to know him, and she starts learning some secrets about him that aren't part of the original story, but which like give the characters in this book more like fully fleshed individual identities, where he maybe is motivated by something that you don't quite expect, and there's a little bit more to his story, there's a little bit more mystery, and they start to develop a possible bond. But can she trust him? Can she not trust him? I don't know, I don't want to tell you, but it's a really captivating story. It kind of has you on the edge of your seat. There's a lot of high stakes throughout this story, and it, like I said, is a retelling of one of my favourites with some interesting new twists that the author adds in. Then we have 100 Nights of Hero by Isabel Greenberg, which is actually a graphic novel. So I think it's the only graphic novel to have made it onto this list. And when I was thinking of books for this list, it took me a moment to come up with this title, because I think, being a graphic novel, I kind of just forgot that it could be on this list, but it should absolutely be there because this is stunning, and it's stunning both as a piece of literature and a piece of artwork. It's one of my favourite graphic novels of all time, and it only adds to that it is a retelling of 1001 Nights. Now in this one we actually have a sapphic romance happening between our Shahrazad-esque character and her female companion, and she's married to a very wicked man, but this wicked man is not actually in the role of the king from the 1001 Nights stories. He instead basically like loans her to another man who's convinced that he can get the Shahrazad character to cheat on her husband, so like that's how they end up together, and instead she deflects him every night by telling him stories along with Hero, who is her companion and lover, and they're narrating these stories and keeping this man distracted, while also trying to like figure out a way to survive and be together. And the book is beautiful. It explores themes of storytelling and the importance of storytelling, and also like the importance of storytelling in the kind of history of human love and LGBTQ plus love, and it's just gorgeous. And I love Isabel Greenberg's art style. She's such a unique illustrator. I love everything she comes out with. I read it all, but today I think this is still my favourite. So the next book on my list is actually a middle grade novel, a children's novel, which is not a retelling but inspired by mythology, specifically of the Caribbean. So this is The Jumbies by Tracy Baptiste. And if the title was not already a giveaway, this book is inspired by Jumbie folklore. So Jumbies are malevolent spirits in Caribbean folklore, and it's a bit of like a catch-all term. They're not necessarily like one specific type of spirit or fairy or creature, but they like encompass all those that would come under that category of like malevolent spirits. And in this story we follow a young girl called Corinne who lives with her father on one of the Caribbean islands, and she's never really known her mother. Her mother died when she was really young, but she misses her and she loves hearing stories about her, and that is important because it ties into why and when and what happens in the book. But otherwise, you know, she spends her days mainly with her father, and they live next to this wood that generally people say don't go in because that's where the Jumbies lurk. Corinne, however, has never like felt that fear or felt their presence, so she just like walks in there whenever she wants, until the very beginning of this book, that is, when she encounters something a little bit suspicious in the woods and runs away, and perhaps the Jumbies are realer than she thought they were. And we then follow Corinne as things start to go slightly awry in her life and the life of her island and her friends and her community, and we get to hear that from the perspective of a strange new woman in town who may or may not be connected to the Jumbies, as well as Corinne and some other characters. And it's just a really gorgeous, entertaining children's adventure that engages with Caribbean folklore. I really enjoyed it. It was just like really entertaining, good fun. I really enjoyed Corinne's relationship with her friends. I love that in particular, but middle grade in general, I love like how much it focuses on friendships and kids banding together. So yeah, this was like an excellent read. On the topic of like childhood mythology and middle grade novels, however, I couldn't film this video and not mention The Snow Spider by Jenny Nemo. This is one of my favourite children's books from when I was a child. So not just that I read as an adult, but from when I was a child. I used to take this book out of the library on cassette tape regularly and just listen to it over and over and over and over again. It's also by one of my favourite childhood authors, Jenny Nemo, who wrote the Charlie Bone books, another series I was a big fan of as a kid. Generally, clearly just really like Jenny Nemo books, but The Snow Spider always stood out to me. And this is one that is not, again, like a direct retelling of anything in particular, but like almost like a follow-on from mythology, shall we say, or one that incorporates different elements of Welsh mythology specifically. So The Snow Spider is the first in the Magician trilogy, which follow a young boy called Gwyn, who is, or who discovers on his 9th birthday that he is a descendant, the Welsh mythological hero Gwydion, a magician and a trickster that features in the Mabinogion, which is a mythological Welsh epic, which is well worth a read if you're just into your mythology in general. Love the Mabinogion. And this is the story of Gwyn, particularly when his sister Bethan goes missing, and it beautifully weaves in aspects of Welsh mythology, little references to the Mabinogion, and it just creates this very like whimsical, otherworldly atmosphere for what is otherwise a book quite rooted in reality. And it's so captivating, and I really need to reread it. Actually, I've just convinced myself that I need to do a reread soon. So yeah, check out The Snow Spider if you haven't already. I do have one more middle grade book on this list, however, so let's get to that next, and that is Arusha and the End of Time by Roshani Chokshi. So this is the first in a middle grade series, which is inspired by Hindu mythology but set in the present day, and it follows our protagonist Arusha, a 12-year-old girl whose mum works in a museum, and she doesn't find her mum's job particularly interesting, but she has to spend a lot of time there. One day, however, in order to try and impress some classmates who really don't deserve to be impressed, she ends up activating a like ancient relic and awakens an ancient demon whose release may end up leading to the end of time, Arusha and the end of time. So she gets pulled into this and discovers that she may or may not be the reincarnation of one of the Pandava brothers. The Pandava brothers being 5 men who are the like main heroes or protagonists of the Hindu epic, the Mahabharata, and that's another just like amazing piece of mythological literature which explores the legends of a specific religion. If you're interested in it, would highly recommend. It's phenomenal. And in Arusha, the author has basically created like a continuation of the Mahabharata, taking some of those themes and those figures and those stories and imagining kind of their continuation in the modern age through the story of Arusha. And it's a gorgeous adventure. Again, we have explorations of friendship and family and connectivity, and it's just so gorgeous and entertaining. Like, you've got some really fully fleshed characters who are very endearing, who you're very much rooting for and you're very invested in, and then you also have like a really just like rip-roaring adventure that you can't stop turning the pages over. So really fantastic. Then last but certainly not least for this video is Savage Her Reply by Deirdre Sullivan. This is an incredibly lyrical novel. Like, the writing is just chef's kiss, absolutely beautiful, which retells the Irish legend of the children of Lear. So in this story, it's another quite tragic Celtic story about, well, who is the protagonist, but about 4 children, the children of Lear, whose stepmother and aunt, so their biological mother's sister becomes their stepmother, turns them into swans out of jealousy because she's desperate to be as loved by her husband as her sister was, and believes that the children are getting in the way of this. And what's really interesting about this book, and I really enjoyed about it and I think made it really different, is this is actually from the perspective of Aoife, who is the stepmother. So it's not from the perspective of any of the children or from the perspective of Lear, it's from the perspective of Aoife, and it's kind of exploring her relationship with a sister she loved dearly and nieces and nephews and stepchildren who she initially also loves dearly, and what motivated her to commit this pretty heinous crime of turning them into swans. There's obviously parallels between the children of Lear and some other like folk tales, particularly European folk tales of like the 6 or 7 swan brothers, but they're also not entirely the same. There's differences, so if it's not one you're familiar with, I'd really recommend reading the Children of Lear and reading Savage Her Reply. I think it's just like a beautifully voiced story that like really dives deep into some of the intricacies of it and creates a much more fully fleshed character than just like a one-dimensional villain, which obviously myth and folklore can sometimes do. So I really love that about it, and I think Deirdre Sullivan just did something really beautiful with this book. Although, like I said, there is tragedy in there and it can be quite heart-wrenching, especially to read about this woman's desperation to be loved. But that, I guess, brings me to the end of this video. Those are 10 books that retell myths from around the world that I really love. Obviously, this is not all encompassing. There's so many more books out there, so many more mythologies out there. But of what I've read, I've really loved these 10 in particular, and I wanted to recommend them to you. And I'm really hoping that you have some more to recommend to me in the comments down below. Obviously, I'm always open to hearing Greek and Roman myth retellings, but if you have any retelling recommendations that are Greek or Roman, I would particularly love to hear them. And I will definitely add them to my TBR. So yeah, but hopefully you also got a recommendation from me and it's not just me asking for recommendations, and generally enjoyed this video. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you again soon. Bye everyone!